Chapter 4, Section 2. The diversity of carbon atoms allows many different molecules to form by bonding with up to 4 other atoms. In this section, we will really see how structure and function are related. 4.2, carbon atoms can form diverse molecules by bonding to 4 other atoms. Remember we learned about the octet rule, where an atom is happiest when its valence is full. A carbon atom has a total of 6 electrons, as you can see in the diagram here. 2 electrons in that first energy shell, and 4 in the second shell. Because of this, carbon has little tendency to form ionic bonds by losing or gaining 4 electrons to complete its valence shell. Carbon usually completes its valence shell by sharing electrons with other atoms in 4 covalent bonds. Those can be single or double, or sometimes even triple bonds. The ability of carbon to form 4 covalent bonds makes large, complex molecules possible. When a carbon atom forms covalent bonds with 4 other atoms, they are rearranged at the corners of an imaginary tetrahedron with bond angles of 109.5 degrees. In molecules with multiple carbon atoms, every carbon atom bonded to 4 other atoms has a tetrahedral shape. When 2 carbon atoms are joined by a double bond, all bonds around those carbons are in the same plane as the carbons. Here you can see the shapes of 3 simple organic molecules. We have methane, which is the simplest of the hydrocarbons. We have molecular structural formulas, we have ball and stick models, and then we have space-filling models. All 4 of those representations are of the same thing. So methane, if we were to add another carbon, we would also have to add 2 more hydrogens, and it becomes a little more complex. Notice how these carbons are still on the same plane. Same thing here with our ethene, or the ethylene molecule. C2H4, we have a double bond, but they are still in the same plane. The electron configuration of carbon enables it to form covalent bonds with many different elements. The valences of carbon and its most frequent partners, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, those are the building codes for the architecture of living molecules. Carbon atoms can partner with atoms of other things besides hydrogen, for example, CO2. In carbon dioxide, or CO2, 1 carbon atom forms 2 double bonds with 2 oxygen atoms. In the structural formula, oxygen double bonded to carbon, double bonded to oxygen. Each line represents a pair of shared electrons. This arrangement completes the valence shells of all the atoms in the molecule. That makes them all happy atoms. Although CO2 can be classified as either organic or inorganic, it's important to the living world. CO2 is the source of carbon for all organic molecules that are found in organisms. CO2 is usually fixed into organic molecules by the process of photosynthesis. So remember in biology we learned that the carbon dioxide going into cellular respiration and photosynthesis is atmospheric. Carbon chains form the skeletons of most organic molecules. Carbon skeleton can vary in length and may be straight, branched, or arranged in closed rings. Carbon skeletons can include double bonds. Atoms of other elements can be bonded to the atoms of the carbon skeleton. Here we can see some examples. The length, the double bond position, and the branching, as well as the presence of rings. Notice here the length. This would be C2H6 because there are 6 hydrogens surrounding those 2 carbons. Every one of these individual carbons has 4 lines coming off of it. That represents the 4 bonds that it's made. Propane would be C3H8. So it's basically the same thing. The length is the only thing that differs. In branching, you can see that we have butane, which is a simple straight hydrocarbon, but then there's this 2-methylpropane. We'll look at some examples in class about how do we name these crazy looking structures. It's actually pretty simple once we get going. The double bond position. The 1-butene versus the 2-butene, as you can tell, it's between the first carbons or the second carbons. That's where those numbers come from. And then the presence of rings. Those benzene rings are important when you get a little bit further into the organic chemistry world. Hydrocarbons are exactly what they sound like. They're organic molecules that consist of only carbon and hydrogen atoms. Hydrocarbons are the major component of petroleum, which is a fossil fuel consisting of partially decomposed remains of organisms that lived millions of years ago. Figure 4.6a, the role of hydrocarbons in fats are that fats are biological molecules that have long hydrocarbon tails attached to a non-hydrocarbon component. Petroleum and fat are hydrophobic compounds that cannot dissolve in water because of their many nonpolar carbon-hydrogen bonds. Hydrocarbons can undergo reactions that release a relatively large amount of energy. Here we can see the triglyceride that's included in the above image of the human fat cells. Each of those fatty acid tails on the triglyceride is full of those non-polar bonds. Isomers are compounds that have the same molecular formula but different structures and therefore different chemical properties. The 3 types of isomers, compounds with the same molecular formula but different structures. We can see that the structural isomers versus the cis-trans isomers and the enantiomers are all very distinctly different. They're also represented in different ways. Here you can see the ball and stick model of all of them. The structural isomers have the same molecular formula, but they differ in the covalent arrangement of atoms. They may also differ in the location of the double bonds. So here we have 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens. Here we have 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens, but they're very distinctly different. Cis-trans isomers have the same covalent partners but differ in the spatial arrangement of atoms around the carbon-to-carbon double bond, which is the centrally located bond. The double bond does not allow the atoms to rotate freely around the bond axis. Consider a simple molecule with 2 double bonded carbons here, each of which has a hydrogen and an X attached to it. The arrangement with both X's on the same side of the double bond is called a cis isomer. The arrangement with the X's on opposite sides is called a trans isomer. Enantiomers are molecules that are mirror images of each other. These are possible when 4 different atoms or groups of atoms are bonded to an asymmetrical carbon. The 4 groups can be arranged in space in 2 different ways that are mirror images of one another. They are like left-handed and right-handed versions of the molecule. Usually one is biologically active while the other is inactive. Even subtle structural differences in 2 enantiomers may have important functional significance because of the emergent properties from specific arrangements of atoms. For example, methamphetamine occurs in 2 enantiomers with very different effects. One is a very highly addictive street drug called crank, while the other is sold for the treatment of nasal congestion. Here we can see another example of ibuprofen. There is an effective enantiomer and an ineffective. Even though they may look the same to the naked eye, one works and the other does not. Albuterol, those of you that have asthma or you've ever had a breathing treatment, you'd be familiar with the albuterol treatments. There's 2 different versions of this as well. It relaxes those bronchial muscles and improves airflow in asthma patients. There's also going to be a link to this video, The Secret Life of Levodopa. I encourage you guys to take a few seconds and click on that and watch it in your own time.